everyone, and welcome to another Florida Native Plant Society Lunch and Learn. This is our first Lunch and Learn of 2024, and I'm very happy to have you. I have a few announcements before we get started. Obviously, Patti is here. Oh, I should point this way. Patti is here in her office in Gainesville. I'm in Orlando, and we have a pre-recorded presentation, which is good because Patti is unfortunately under the weather today. So you'll get to hear her husky, plugged nose voice later. So please put your questions in the chat for everyone to learn from the things that you have questions about. Before we get started, I have a few announcements. Our annual fund drive is still going. So while you won't get a tax deduction for donating in 2023, you can still get a tax deduction for donating in 2024. And it's really important for us to continue this work for continuing the lunch and learns and our other educational programming, our plant rescues, and our conservation work. So here I have our little Palmetto ad. You can help us reach our $50,000 goal. Last time I checked, we were at 37. So it would be really helpful if you'll donate. I will drop the link in the chat. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is the Florida legislative session is starting on January 9th. It's an early session. So I have heard people say that this is the 60 most dangerous days for Floridians and their property. I will add also for the native plants of Florida. We will have many bills that we are supporting, especially in land conservation, but we will have many bills that we are not supporting and hope do not continue through the legislature. So if you would like to know more about the policy work that we're doing, we have an action alert email list, and I will send out emails for bills that you can take action to prevent them from moving forward. So I will put that link in the chat once the video for Patti gets started. Thank you so much for coming on today. The presentation is about 30 minutes, and then join us back here for Q&A. Again, please put your questions in the chat anytime they come to you, and we'll handle them at the end.
Hello, I'm Patti Anderson, a botanist with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services and the Division of Plant Industry. We're here today to continue our exploration of the basics of botany and enjoy the plant kingdom. So we're going to focus on flowers and fruits today, the amazing diversity of plants out there. One of the reasons we want to go over some of the terms for plant structures with flowers and fruits in particular is to begin to notice differences. Sometimes when you have a name for a thing, you begin to recognize it, and you can separate differences to help you identify plants. And part of the goal is to understand and be able to identify plants that you come in contact with. Knowing the terms can help you understand botanical texts, and as we'll see, there's an amazing diversity in the plant kingdom. I hope you'll be able to appreciate that a little more. So speaking of diversity, sometimes people ask, how many plants are there? And from this diagram, you can see that the older relatives of flowering plants, the mosses, they're about 21,000. There are about 12,000 of species of ferns worldwide. Our conifers, the cone-bearing plants, cycads and gymnosperms, are about 11,000 species. And flowering plants, knock your socks off, over 300,000 species of plants that produce flowers. So this is a big group. And to get to know them, some people are able just to learn to look at a species, look at a plant, and know the species. It's like recognizing your children in a crowd, I guess. You have to spend a lot of time with the plants to get to recognize them easily just by looking. Other people learn to recognize plant families and use what are called dichotomous keys to logically deduce the name of a plant. And then in these days of modern times, there are people who have apps on their phone. Now, being an old fogey, I did not believe these apps would be useful. I figured they would make mistakes, and I just disparaged them. But then I went on a trip, a vacation to a place that had a different habitat, different flora, and I was baffled. I mean, I didn't even know the family of some of the plants I was seeing. So I thought, I'll try these apps. And sure enough, I could confirm that what they were telling me was true. Now, I've tried it in Florida and have not had as good results because I guess Florida is such an unusual place and our flowers are so special, or at least the leaves of our plants, that the apps had difficulty. But I am no longer disparaging them. I will even get it over with and tell you the names of two that have been recommended, PlantNet and iNaturalist, and you're welcome to use those. But I would encourage you to learn to identify plants on your own because you never know when you're going to be out in a forest with no coverage. Then what will you do? So today, as I said, we'll talk about flowers and fruits, but I hope you were able to see the previous presentation about leaves, stems, and roots. If not, it should be available on the Florida Native Plant Society website for you to review. So plants, we're all familiar with flowers. They're beautiful. We love them. We get bouquets, we get corsages, we plant them in our yards, we admire them in forests. But when we look at the parts of a flower, it's pretty simple, even though it seems like there's huge variation in those parts. Plants have basically 4 parts, and they're in what we call whorls, like a ring of the same kind of part. The outermost, the part you see when the flower is in bud, it's often green, and each is called a sepal. Combination of sepals is called the calyx, and sometimes the individual leaf-like sepals can be fused together, and we call that the calyx as well. The petals, the colorful part of the flower, usually the next swirl of parts, and together they're called the corolla. Inside the ring of petals are stamens, which are composed of an anther and filament. The filament is the long stalk, is often yellow, but it can be other colors, and that holds the pollen, which is the male, we say the male part of the plant. The pollen fertilizes the ovules, which are found in, when I was studying botany, it was called the pistil. Now carpel is a more common term for the structure that has a stigma, sticky receptive part of the carpel that pollen will adhere. The style, which is a tube that leads to the ovules, which will develop into seeds. And that's all the parts of the flower. Not a lot going on, but amazing 300,000 different kinds. The sepals, as we said, are the part you see when the flower is in bud. It protects the developing flower. The petals usually attract pollinators, the insects or birds that will carry the pollen to another plant. The stamens hold the pollen, and the pistil or carpel is where we find the fruit and seeds. The flowers can have a number of shapes, which helps to explain the variety we see and the diversity. When we talk about flower shapes, we're talking about the sepals and petals together. And of course, we have another name for that. It's called the perianth, and it means around the anthers, perianth. We'll just go through these different shapes that are commonly used in descriptions. Campanulate is bell-shaped. Perhaps you've heard of campaniles, bell towers. It's the same root. Funnel form, you've probably seen or used a funnel. These flowers have fused petals that taper gradually to the rim. Rotate is round or disc shape and usually very flat, like a compact disc or some other disc that you've heard of. Then there's salviform, which is abruptly flaring. So there's a tube, and then the tips of the petals are separate and flare out. Then there's simply tubular, which looks like a cylinder. Urceolate, which looks like an urn, which is rounded, but the tips of the petals flare a little bit. Then there are special forms found in legumes and a couple of other plants, but they look like butterflies if you stretch your imagination, and they're called papilionaceous. You might have heard the French word papillon for butterfly. And then we have special flowers that are in the family of sunflowers and daisies. The flower is actually a combination, a composite of many flowers. Each of the petal-like organs is a flower, and in the center, there's a cluster of flowers. We'll go over that a bit more. Here you can see photographs of those abstract drawings. So a campanulate flower that's bell-shaped, funnel form. You can't see the tube very well, but morning glories are pretty familiar. So a tube and then a broad tip. Salviform, you know, I thought salviform was just the name of this kind of flower with a narrow tube that abruptly opens. But in fact, there's a kind of tray that's a flat tray with a narrow foot or stand to hold it up. So now I've learned that salver is a thing, and the flower was named for the salver. So we have salviform flower. Here we have the composite flower, the sunflower, or our state flower, the coreopsis. Each of these petal-like flowers is called a ray flower, like rays of the sun. And in the center, they're disc flowers, and you probably have eaten sunflower seeds that come from these flowers that form a disc in the center of the whole group of flowers. A nice native example of tubular flowers is the coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. Blueberries are good examples of urceolate, urn-shaped flowers. And here's an urn. You can see if it were tipped over, it would have that rounded edge with a flaring tip. And here are a couple of very sweet peas illustrating the papilionaceous butterfly-shaped flower. Another thing that helps us identify plants is where the ovary resides. And we talked about the pistil or the carpel having a stigma where pollen lands, a style where pollen grows down to the ovary where the seeds are kept. So we can have the term superior ovary when the ovary rests on top of the attachment of the petals and sepals, the other plant parts. A plant can be half inferior, which means half the ovary is below the attachment of the petals and sepals, because they fuse together and help protect the ovary, at least for part of the way. And then we have what's called the inferior ovary, where the ovary is below the attachment of the sepals and petals and other flower parts. And you probably will recognize right away some plants that you've seen, like zucchinis or other squash with a squash blossom. So there you can see that the petals are attached. There's the anthers or the stigma. And here's the expanded ovary, making the fruit that we eat. It's below the petals and sepals, so it's inferior. Here we see a rose family member. It has fused flower parts around part of the ovary, and then the ovary continues, so it's called half inferior. And then the superior ovary, you see this orange blossom, and you can see the ovary resting on top of the attachment of the petals and sepals. We also have terms for how the flowers are arranged when they're not solitary flowers. So buckle your seatbelts. We're going to plow right through. Flowers can be arranged in a spike, where there's a group of flowers attached directly to the stem. You might call them sessile, without a stalk. Then we have what we call a raceme. They're very similar to a spike. You might be tempted to call it that, but each of the flowers has a stalk to attach it to the main stem. Then those stalks might have branches, and there are many variations on the theme of a branched inflorescence, but just start with panicle and you'll get pretty far in the inflorescence world. One of my favorites is the umbel, and that's because it's shaped like an umbrella with the spokes of the umbrella spreading from a single point. And that was the first one I was able to remember and recognize. Then we have again the composite head of the sunflower family, the Asteraceae or Compositae. They have a kind of platform on which all these flowers are attached to make a head. And what is the purpose of these flowers and all their variations? Well, it's mainly to attract pollinators, especially the beautiful, colorful flowers that have bright petals or even colorful sepals. And they're shapes of flowers that will be attractive to different kinds of pollinators. And you might want to plant a pollinator garden to encourage different kind of visitors to the plants. Birds, insects, butterflies, all are interesting to watch. You might enjoy seeing some of them, although in Florida we mainly have mosquito-eating bats. The other way pollen gets spread around is by wind, and you will notice that these flowers from our live oak, the Quercus virginiana, are not all that attractive. You might even miss them if you were looking in a tree. But to be dispersed by the wind, you don't really have to attract the wind that much. You just have to have pollen that will fly around easily. Many people are allergic to pollens that are wind dispersed. But if you're noticing a beautiful flower, you're not likely to be allergic to that pollen because it's very sticky, so it can attach itself to the feathers of the bird or the limbs of the insect. So this pollination is a great thing for spreading genes around. You get more diversity when you have genes from two different plants crossing to make the next generation. And some plants have diversified in a way to ensure they're going to get cross-pollination by having separate male and female flowers, or separate plants with stamens and carpels. So for example, the persimmon, Diospyros virginiana, you can see that some flowers have the anthers and some have the ovary, the stigma, and style. It even has two stigmas and styles. But this way, the individual flower can't pollinate itself. And the same was true with hollies. You might have heard that you have to have a female holly tree in order to have the beautiful red berries that come from the white flowers. The male trees, or the trees with stamens, have flowers as well, but they don't produce fruits because fruits come from the ovary of the flower. So cross-pollination is a wonderful thing to ensure diversity, but wouldn't you know it, some plants have developed mechanisms so they avoid cross-pollination. They have hidden flowers that are underground. They're called cleistogamous, which is vaguely Greek for closed marriage. It means that the plant grows underground and the petals and sepals stay closed. So the only pollen available is from an individual flower. And you might say to yourself, why would they ever do that? But if you imagine one of our worst weeds, Commelina bengalensis, the tropical spiderwort, it grows in agricultural fields and areas that might be mowed or plowed. If you cut down the entire plant that's above ground, it has these underground flowers that can be pollinated within an individual flower and produce seeds that are then available to grow the next season. And so it's almost impossible to get rid of the plant by mowing. And even if you pull it up, some of those flowers might be caught in the soil and stay behind. So it's a technique for surviving bad times. And the lovely violets, viola, also have hidden flowers. So it's not just weedy plants, but some of our ornamentals might try to avoid the hazards of being eaten or stepped on with this kind of hedging of potential accidents by having these underground cleistogamous flowers. Now we'll talk a little about fruits. There are many different kinds of fruits. One of my favorite kinds is the fleshy fruit we call berries. And yes, tomatoes are berries. Even though in the grocery store you'll find them with the vegetables, the botanical definition of a fruit is an expanded ovary with many seeds. That's a tomato. You can even see the remnants of some of the flower parts on fruits. Like these blueberries, you can see the remnant calyx that's opposite the attachment to the stem, which tells me the ovary was growing below the attachments of the sepals and petals. And I think that means an inferior ovary. Here we see the persimmon growing, and the fruit is above the attachment of the calyx, the fused sepals to the stem. So I think that's a superior ovary. Although I like blueberries better, so they're the superior fruit in my book. There are other kinds of fruits, not berries. You're probably familiar with lovely peaches from Georgia. They're called stone fruits because there's a single hard structure on the inside, like a stone, and inside that stone is the actual seed. These are called drupes, the plants that have the stone with the seed inside, surrounded by fleshy tissue. Now, apples are in the family of roses. You'll remember seeing the flower that was half inferior because it had this floral tissue that was fused to the sides of half the ovary. Well, when the fruit matures, there's this tissue that expands, and there's just a kind of papery wall around the ovary enclosing the seed. So that's the apple core. Who knew? They all had names. So that kind of fruit is called a plum. You can get extra points in Scrabble, I'm sure, if you know these terms. Then there are two kinds of fruit that are often confused: multiple fruits and aggregate fruits. These are when fruits are fused together in some way. So if we think of a pineapple, all those little sections of the pineapple are fused together from many flowers. So many flowers make a multiple fruit. You could think of MF, many flowers, multiple fruit. So each flower blooms, produces seeds, and thickens to create the fruits that are attached and fused together. If you think of blackberries, raspberries, they have one flower that produces several carpels that fuse together from that single flower. So they're called an aggregate fruit. So an aggregate is a single flower. I don't know if that will help you remember or if you need to remember, but just appreciate the diversity of fruits as well as flower shapes, and it'll be a good day. Fruits can also be dry instead of fleshy. You're probably familiar with milkweeds. They have a dry fruit that splits open on one side, and that's called a follicle. It's very similar to a legume, but the legume splits on both sides. And I don't have to tell you about the diversity of legumes, but now you know the legume is the name of the fruit. Other dry fruits are within a category we call achenes. Now, achenes means a dry fruit with a single seed. But of course, plants have many variations on this theme. We can give them names like samaras, if we think of the ash tree or the maple, where the single seed is surrounded by what we call wings, fleshy tissue. They could be a nut. They're surrounded by a tough outer shell. And the sunflower family, Asteraceae, has a special term Cypsella for its achenes. But you could just call them achenes and you'd be fine. The rose hip has these achenes inside it. So there's the swollen tissue, but the real fruit is inside, and it's an achene. So how do these fruits create the next generation? They have to get away from the parent plant, and they have several mechanisms for doing that. Some just cast their seeds to the wind and hope for the best. You're probably familiar with dandelions spreading everywhere. That's a good example of wind-dispersed fruits. Sometimes they're a little pesky, but it's a good technique for the plant. Then we have animal-dispersed plants. You're probably familiar with Spanish needles or other plants that will attach themselves to your shoes and socks and pants and any other thing they can attach themselves to, your dog, your cat, whatever passes by, they can grab onto. Or to the Velcro-like legume Desmodium, which will stick to you with many different shapes of the fruit, but all of them with those sticky curling hairs that attach to many different surfaces. The fleshy fruits are attractive to birds and other, sometimes mammals. And then, of course, our friends, the squirrels, are nuts for nuts. So if you were at the first presentation, you might remember this slide. But if not, I encourage you to go back and look at that one to learn some more of the terms about leaves, stems, and roots. But I'll assume that you remember that presentation, and we can now understand more about the Bignoniaceae family. They're often woody vines. They have opposite compound leaves, and that means at any node, there are leaves across from each other. They're compound because the bud is at the node on the stem, and each of these is a leaflet to create an entire leaf. The flowers have fused sepals and fused petals. You can see the sepals fused at the base of these. Is it campanulate? Is it funnel form? I think funnel form because it's kind of gradual. There are 4 stamens of 2 different lengths, like 2 sets of twins. If you open a tubular flower and see 2 sets of stamens of the same height, well, the 2 sets are different heights, you can be pretty sure it's in this family. And it might be a trumpet creeper. It might be a crossvine. It might be cat's claw. So watch out. And if you see the fruits, they look a lot like a legume. And inside, there are seeds with wings so they can fly. They're very light and they can spread easily. So I hope you have at least started to understand the kinds of flowers and fruits and terms that describe them. If you need more information, there are many websites with names, descriptions, photographs, and you can look at some of these from this page. There are also many books I'd recommend. If you're a gardener, Scott Zona's new A Gardener's Guide to Botany is very helpful. If you want to know more about families, Zomleffer's Guide to Flowering Plant Families is wonderful. If you like photographs and relate more to images, you might try to find Kastner's Photographic Atlas of Botany. Roger Hammer's Complete Guide to Florida Wildflowers is also filled with terrific photographs and descriptions of the Florida wildflowers. And any of these could help you identify plants and have glossaries or other information that could be useful to you. So I know it can be a daunting task. I've been there. It's taken me years to learn the small bit of botany I already know. So I encourage you to go forward. And when you're on those hikes and people are talking in Latin, you just remember everybody knows something, and you can learn from those people and they can learn from you, even if it's just to say, there's a beautiful flower. I wonder what that is. So keep looking and enjoying the plant kingdom.
Petioles and internodes and roots adventitious, stem storing carbs for meals so delicious, anthers and stamens and pollen that clings. These are a few of my favorite things. When the names change like a shell game, when they say DNA, I simply admire all angiosperms, and then I don't fear those terms. Is it leaves or leaflets, simple or compound? What were those flowers that bloom underground? Kingdoms and orders and genus and species, Linnaeus gives my brain terrible creases. When it's Latin, when it's Greek, when the words make me freak, I simply admire all angiosperms, and then I don't fear those terms.
Thank you for that wonderful song, Patti. Surprisingly for this particular one, I didn't have any questions that came up. I just felt like everything was so clear. You're muted. No, we can't hear you. Oh, you gotta turn off the YouTube, Patti. Okay. Betsy says, bravo, Patti's songs are one of my favorite things.
Thank you so much, Betsy.
I want to apologize to everybody for my audio quality. This computer that I have is like a gaming style computer, and the fans are just super loud, and the camera's here, and that's where the microphone is. And I do have this little microphone that sits here that, reduces the noise, but I don't have the little cable. I couldn't find the cable, so sorry to everyone. So nobody has any questions. I guess, you know what? I will resurrect my question about the sugar apple from last month.
Could you remind me of your question?
What kind of fruit is it?
Well, if you think about the flower of the sugar apple, if you've seen one, it's a single flower with a whole ball of stamens, and in the center there's a ball of pistils. So it's a single flower that makes an aggregate fruit, not multiple flowers with a multiple fruit. So they, as the ovaries develop, they're fused together and make the fruit, and each separate carpel has a seed. So it's an interesting aggregate fruit. If you have a raspberry and a sugar apple together, you could see the correspondence.
Linda Ginn says, yes, everything was clearly explained, and I love your favorite things.
Thank you. Well, Florida Native Plant Society is one of my favorite things as well. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Patti. And if anyone wants to hear more of Patti's songs, you do know she has a YouTube channel called Patti Sings.
I do.
She recently posted a Christmas, not album, but a Christmas concert.
Well, thank you all for listening and watching. And if you have questions, I think my email is available. You can always send a question directly.
sorry. Yes,
Hold on.
I should
Help
let me
you.
post it in the chat for everyone.
Okay.
But it was, I think you had it on the slide as well. Okay, there we go. Yes, please message Patty if you need anything, and keep your eyes peeled for legislative session alerts. We won't have a pre-session briefing like other organizations, but I'll be sending out an email on Monday with more information about our legislative priorities for this year and links to other organizations' pre-session briefings. And we do plan to have a mid-session briefing at the end of the month. So we can keep an eye on what's happening in Tallahassee that affects our native plants and ecosystems.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.